What's up, guys, and welcome to the Level Health Podcast. Today, Josh is interviewing Drew Caudill. Drew is a mobility coach and strength specialist based in Concord, New Hampshire. He's also the owner of Paradigm Performance, and he brings a ton of personal experience and his drive for self-education to his training approach. In this episode, we're talking about his origins in fitness, why he's so focused on sharing the truth instead of feeding into misinformation, and of course, our favorite topic, how the personal training industry can improve, which he answered with a lot of enthusiasm. Big thanks to Drew for coming on the show. You can follow him on Instagram at drew.caudill. He's got some great original fitness memes on there, so definitely go check him out. You can also visit his website, paradigmperformancecpt.com. We'll have the links for that in the description below. For those of you that don't already know, our website, Level Health, is a directory, community, and network of qualified health and fitness professionals. We want to help create a space where clients and patients are able to find the right professional for them. We have accounts for both clients and professionals. Client accounts are always free, and there's 2 different membership levels for pros. If you haven't signed up already, head over to levelhealth.net and set up your membership. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode.
You put out a lot of great info, not just on movement, which is what we're really going to focus on today, but also just pretty much every other aspect of health and fitness, because I love when I see somebody that can just break it down, because like it always ends up coming back to the basics, but you have to be able to put a little flair on it so it's interesting to people. But like I said, for this one, I really wanted to focus on the importance, more specifically, the importance of movement as we age. And how are we able to move, we'll define what that is, more effectively and efficiently, and to do it throughout, across our entire lifespan as we just end up degrading like we're going to. But before we hit on that, can you just fill us in on your story a little bit, man? Can you tell us about who you are and why you do what you do?
Yeah. So, wow, that's a long ass story. I'll try to make it really short. So I started off like when I was a young kid, grew up super poor, a little bit overweight, classic story. And I wasn't around the healthiest people. My mom has type 2 diabetes, stepdad, drug addict, alcoholic, you name it. So like health wasn't always like at the forefront for me, but that's something that I like longed for almost. So, long story short, I end up getting into exercise, but I really didn't know what I was doing. And I remember that I would watch a lot of these, I forget his fucking name. What's his name? Chris Gethin. You ever heard of that guy?
Yes, with a K.
Oh yeah,
Chris with a K.
Yeah, owner of Caged Muscle. And he would do these like little like, workout with me type vids, and they were like crazy, super hardcore. I had no idea what I was doing. But that got me into it. I was like, oh shit, like this guy's kind of telling me what to do, and it, gives me a plan. That's cool. But I also didn't know exactly what that was doing for me. So fast forward like, 2 years of just guest working in the gym, lifting weights, but, just kind of like working out, not actually like training my body.
Yeah.
I was doing that for a long time, and, I was like, yeah, this is cool and all, but I really don't know like the why behind any of this. And that's kind of whack. And nobody was really explaining that to me. And that was really what I wanted to know the most of. So I hire a trainer from recommendation of my buddy, and what he said was going against everything that I've ever learned the last like 2 or 3 years. And at first I was skeptical. He was saying like, eat more carbs, eat more calories, lift some weights more. Your squat looks like shit. And had me fix that. And I was like, yeah, whatever. I'll listen to you. I'm paying you money, so I'm trusting you. So, and then that happened, and then shattered my fucking paradigm, my mind. And that's kind of where I got the name from too. It was like, the way that I thought things were supposed to be done for a long time are not exactly what they seem. So I wanted to also give that to somebody else, because I was in the same spot. I don't want people to, try really hard for a few years and not really make it anywhere. It shouldn't be that hard. And it doesn't have to be that hard. If you learn right from the beginning, then you just, the rest of your life is just maintaining that practice. So yeah, that's why I did it.
That's fascinating, because obviously having a plan is step one, like having some sort of structure is step one, but we do get led down the wrong path. I mean, I started lifting when I was 12, and it was almost the exact opposite of what I should be doing. It was just really infrequent, really intense when it was done. Just eating just all the supplements in the world, but none of the good foods in the world. But
Yeah.
it was just an interesting time. And um, my paradigm was similarly shattered by Mind Pump, actually, because I went through that arc of that dumbness for probably over a decade, and then I ran into CrossFit, which for whatever its flaws, it introduced compound lifts to me. And then from there, I actually ran into Mind Pump. This was back late 2015, and I discovered their Map to Red, their anabolic, which was just basic periodization, just a really basic program, but it was so effective because it put into practice basic principles. And I think that's like after you bang your head against the wall for a while, you either quit or you figure out those fucking principles so that you can keep going. And I've always kind of thought that that was such an important aspect that a trainer could bring to working with clients, was having done so much shit wrong. And when when you talk with people, you're almost like, you want to separate yourself from the bias some, right? So you try to say that these are the principles, but everybody's going to be looking at it like, oh, that's just their thing. So it kind of depends on when you meet with the people too. So that was the other aspect, is like, I had these facts, like, you learn these principles, your paradigm was shattered, and then you tried to bring that to people. So that's interesting how you're kind of in a similar spot with that transformation. You're in kind of like giving backstage. So that's kind of where I see myself as well.
Nice.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. So when you started lifting, what was the reason behind it? It sounds pretty similar to me, because similar situation. We grew up pretty poor, and I saw training as kind of an equalizer. And fuck, when you're going through puberty, everything works then. So it's pretty dang easy to start standing out and be noticed and stuff like that. What was your motivations behind it?
I started to like girls for real. Like,
Fair enough.
I was, like I said, I was like a little bit of an overweight kid. And that meant I had some, like, no shame in it. I had some pretty big, like, man boobs, bro. And I wanted to, like, I always went to the beach, and I was always wearing my shirt, and I felt wicked uncomfortable, um and that's just the truth of it, man. And
Yeah.
like, so I started getting into, like, cardio first, and obviously that didn't last too long. I ended up, like, getting into a really unhealthy practice of, like, wearing trash bags and doing 2 hours of cardio at a time while I, like, let a movie play in the background, and I just, like, let it go and let it go. And that is, like, I woke up one day and I was like, man, it really, really shouldn't be this hard to, like, get what I need to do done. So naturally I started reading more into it. I went in bodybuilding.com forums. I would stop in the grocery stores, pick up all the men's health magazines. I started talking to other people at my gym, asking for advice, and that's kind of how I got up into it. And then, after I worked with that trainer and stuff, I felt like I was at a point where I was like, I learned enough from him, and I wanted more answers. And that's really when I started to become, like, that's when I purchased my first certification. And I went through NASM. That was a really nice one. And yeah, dude, the rest is history. I went through NASM and worked as a trainer part time while I worked as a construction worker. I was doing
What role does it play, or not moving play into our degradation? What role does moving play in just longevity?
Well, once the body reaches a certain point, the body starts to literally break down on itself if you don't take care of it. Like, let's say you're a desk worker. You work at a desk for like 20 years, and you don't really do too much outside of that. You're gonna run into problems like osteoporosis and osteopenia, and your muscle tissue just isn't gonna be what it was like 10 years ago. Why? Because you didn't use it. But if you take someone else, and they, when they were a little baby, they started doing the splits, and when they were going through school, you put them in gymnastics, they were splitting. And then when they graduated school, they went to the Olympics, splits. And then then they get the gold medal in the Olympics. They're like, what the hell do I do now? They open up a shop, they teach splits. So all their entire life they split. What are they going to be able to do by the time they're 80, 90, the fucking splits.
Splits.
The splits. Why? Because they spent so much time in that position and their tissues just, that was their natural length. They could control that tension under length better because they were using that. But let's say that same person went through the Olympics, and after the Olympics, they were like, nah, man, I'm good. That was the Olympics. I crossed that off my list and done. And then they stopped doing the splits. What will happen? Can't do the splits in a few years. Like when they're 80, 90 years old, you ask them to do the splits, they probably would not be able to do it to the extent that they were able to do it when they were in the Olympics. And that's just kind of like, once your body doesn't get a movement, once it doesn't receive an input within a certain range of motion, it forgets it. Your body's an incredibly efficient work of art. You know what I mean? It is always adapting, constantly picking like, what's the best way to attack this problem? If the problem is that you don't have a certain range and wherever, and you work within a certain range a little bit more, your body's going to favor that range that you work in more, forget more about the ranges that you don't work in. So next time you go into that range, you're kind of screwed. And that's why I think like taking care of your movement and like moving well is so important, because it's not just as serious as the splits. It's as serious as like your knee being able to rotate. Let's say you are an avid hiker and you're 60 years old or whatever, or JK. Let's flip that on its head. Let's say you're just a hiker and you haven't been hiking for a long time, and like you're a sedentary individual. If you were to go on a hike and all of a sudden like a rock just slips from under your foot, and then your knee goes one way and your ankle goes the other way, your knee is fucked. Like it is, because or it's at a higher risk of being fucked. Let's just say that, because injury is inevitable. You're going to get hurt someday. But if you were to take care of that ankle and you were to take care of that knee, the chance of you getting injured when you're an adult is going to be far less. You're going to be a lot like safer, more bulletproof, unbreakable.
It's a good way to put it. And I'm glad we touched on adapting, because that's really the common theme, both adapting in a positive way and adapting in a negative way. Overuse, disuse, actually stimulating and stressing tissues and making them stronger. But that's really, like I said, kind of the main theme is, are you adapting in a way that's going to be conducive for long-term health? Or are you adapting in a way that's not quite so? But what are some of the common restrictions, limitations to movement that you see with people coming in to you? And that's kind of leads into, what does your assessment process look like?
Well, a lot of the let's start off with the typical stuff that happens when I see someone in like a squat. A typical movement like a squat, you want to be able to do for obvious reasons. A lot of the things that I see is a lot of internal rotation of the hips, or too much or too little internal rotation of the hips, and like collapsing of the ankles. A lot of people really are desensitized to their feet. And it comes down to like gait, and it comes down to the way they stand and posture, whatever.
Shoes and stuff like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So the shoes that you wear, they're really messing with people's feet. And I see that a whole lot, especially as I go through my assessment process. We take a look at your ankles. Now, if we're talking about a squat, you need a considerable amount of ankle dorsiflexion. That's something that not a lot of people have. Why? Because they typically sit in a chair for most of the time. They're not really sitting in a deep squat most of the day. That's like one population. I guess it really comes down to like, what do I see the most of? It depends on the person.
Yeah.
Like if I've got a super active individual, like a plumber or something, maybe their shoulders have more problems than the other person who sits at a desk more often. You know what I mean?
Yes, sir.
But the assessment process is, I use the FRA, so that's a functional range assessment by Functional Range Systems. Dr. Andrew Spina takes all the credit for that. I think it's awesome. I use over 30 plus measurements to take a look at joint rotation, hip internal rotation, shoulder internal rotation, knee internal rotation. And then I break down all of the joints and see how well they move linear and the other way. And then you go through a full CARS assessment. So after I take a look at how the joint performs on its own, moving out and in, rotating in and out, then I see how well you can move it through space on your own. So that's a big one too. And if you have good, if you can hold a position, that's one thing. But if you can move through a position, that's a whole other animal.
Yeah.
So we make sure that everybody can move like a human can, making sure that they have like enough shoulder space, make sure they have enough workspace in the hip. So if I check some dude and he is really, really limited on internal rotation and he can't even get past 90-degree laying down on the floor into hip flexion, am I going to throw that guy under a barbell and tell him to squat? No, definitely not. I'm going to have him, we're going to assess those things, make those joints work as they should first as we strength train. And a lot of people get confused about the FRC approach of mobility, is that they think it's like all just mobility. You can have the best of both worlds. I think they're actually pretty similar, strength training and FRC.
I think they definitely complement each other.
Absolutely.
I mean, you continue to see studies coming out directly testing resistance training with a proper range of motion and actual static stretching, and they're equal, if not leaning towards resistance training being more effective, right?
Yeah, they've been saying it's like even as a warm up, like doing a few quick reps of like just body weight squats have been more effective than just sitting in like a weird stretch, like a hip flexor stretch. If you just sit on a foam roller and you stretch out your lats or your hip flexors for like 30 seconds and stuff, and then go right into a deep, heavy squat, the amount of control you're going to have is going to be, laughable compared to if you just went into a body weight squat, lowered yourself under control. But FRC teaches you how to get into your end ranges, your true end ranges without compensation, and then how to introduce more tension under length. So like, at the bottom of a squat, like you need, like we said, more dorsiflexion, right? So if you can just passively get into that stretch, but you don't have a whole lot of control there and you just kind of hold it for 30 seconds, when you go into a squat, you're going to be kind of like screwed. You're not going to really that's not where your power is. You know what I mean? Your power is about like a few degrees back from that. So that's when you see people like really bounce off the bottom of their squat. They might have that dorsiflexion, but do they have that much control there? Probably not too much. Rather than bringing your ankle into max dorsiflexion, holding it, try to use the tissue to increase that range of motion, pull yourself further into it. That over time will give you a lot more of a sturdy foundation in your squat. Sorry, I went off on like a mini rant there.
No, I'm all for it, man. I wanted to ask, what responsibility do you think that personal trainers have to assessing and improving movement within their clients? Just like your average personal trainer, obviously you specialize in movement. However, I think that there's definitely a certain degree that needs to be a prerequisite for a personal trainer to understand in terms of how their clients are moving. But what responsibility do you think that the average personal trainer starting out, what degree should they understand movement?
They should at least understand what it looks like, and that's a kind of a fucking loaded question, honestly, because it looks different for everybody. You know what I mean? But you only see that with experience. Like when you, let's say rewind a few years ago when I just had an NASM certification, I would take people through like the squat assessment because that's what they teach you, right?
Mhm.
And I would look at it and I'm like, that doesn't look like the book. So you have a really shitty squat. Um, but that's kind of like, that's not enough, So if I had to say that, like, what prerequisites do trainers need to have to like know the difference is doing their due diligence,
Yeah,
getting putting the reps in, you know what I mean?
exactly.
Because like,
Yeah.
and really just like giving a shit, like if
Mhm.
you see some dude squat and you're like, that does not look right, but you know that he wants to build strength, are you going to listen to the client and be like, he wants to build strength, might as well throw him under a bar, got to give him what he wants? Or are you going to listen to yourself or in your gut and be like, well, this guy's squat looks pretty fucked up, I don't think I'm going to put a bar on his back? It comes down to like the trainer doing their due diligence, A, and B, putting in the reps with, as many clients as they possibly can get their hands on.
Yeah, yeah, and just not being complacent while they're doing it. I guess the point there was that you don't have to be necessarily an expert in human movement, like, or even be necessarily pursuing that to be a personal trainer. But
No.
it does absolutely seem like somewhat of a requirement that you learn to be able to assess these things because they're going to impact your client's longevity in that field. And there's so many other aspects that are going to play into that as well, whether they're, healthy and happy over the long term. But movement is going to be a big, big part of that.
Right. And I'm no fucking expert, dude. Like,
Mhm.
I am no expert on biomechanics whatsoever. I'm still a student, but I don't think I'll ever call myself an expert. You know what I mean? There's
That's
still shit
dangerous.
to learn. Yeah, there's still shit to learn all the time. And that's the type of mindset that a lot of trainers have to go in with it. You don't have to be an expert, but you should at least know enough to manage a human body. That's a big responsibility. And not a lot of kids who are coming into personal training like kind of get that. um, they're like, oh yeah, this is cool, I'm a personal trainer, get super
Hmm.
shredded, work out, get paid for it, it's awesome. But you're managing living human organisms. You should at least know the bare basics of human biomechanics, and then back that up by giving a shit, and then like furthering your research whenever you can, staying up to date with current studies, because we're constantly learning more. And like, I feel like now is where the most and best information has been presented to us. So we have to like
Absolutely.
do our due diligence as trainers to really give the people what they need and also what they want.
Yeah, just take it not this is going to sound like a little bit of a scolding, but just take it a little bit more seriously than I think a lot of people do. That's kind of a common
Yeah.
theme that I've heard from trainers across the board because there is kind of a dichotomy where there's the ones that take it seriously and they're passionate about it and they take the time to learn and they study and stuff like that. And then there's the people that, like you said, it's just get shredded. And actually, I saw an ad. I think it was an ASM. I hope it wasn't. I hope I'm misremembering, but it was literally an ad that said, "As a personal trainer, you get paid to work out." And I'm like,
uh,
that was the ad. That was
that
their
sounds like
pitch.
ACE.
Yeah, it was pretty disappointing because number one, I had never once got paid to work out. Number
No.
two, that's not the point. That's almost the least. That's one of the least important aspects of it. Whether or not you are in shape as a trainer definitely can play a role in how many clients you get and stuff like that. But it definitely doesn't mean that you know what the heck you're doing.
Yeah.
And so moving on to the most practical, pragmatic question of this whole conversation, what are some movements, functions, and demands that most people will meet in their daily life? And then how can we get better at these? And then how can we get better at these and stay better at these as we age?
Hmm. All right. Well, definitely squatting. That's like,
Yeah.
that's a go. That's what you need. Deadlifting, I would argue that that's a pretty common movement. Pressing anything is a pretty common movement, and lunging. I've got a lot of people who get
Mm-hmm.
down on like one knee all the time, and they get up so weird, and that has caused problems for them over time. I've got some 67-year-old clients who, they work with little kids, and then they get down on one knee or they squat down to the floor and it's just not correct form, and then they do it over and over and over and over and over again for years, and now they've got this weird squat, and now I ask them to squat normal and they look like a newborn deer. So how do we take care of that, and how do we like manage that as we go about life? Do them.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Practice the movement. And then there's a big difference between just working out and doing something and practicing the movement. You know, if you are going through, practice the squat, and not just a back squat, but different ways. You know, a front squat or a goblet squat. You're not always going to squat with something straight across your back. You're going to be squatting with stuff in your hands, by your
You're
side,
usually
on your
not, right?
shoulder.
You're usually
Exactly.
not going to be squat that way.
Right. Um, then for deadlifts, um, you know, train deadlifts in different ways, different lengths, on one leg, on two legs. Um, you know, slow down the tempo a little bit. At the like, really, it goes for the same for everything. Like,
Hmm.
just move, do the movements, and practice them on a daily, not a daily basis, but practice them frequently. Try your best to get better at the movement. Focus on getting stronger. Focus on, if there's pain in a movement, get rid of the pain first, and then get stronger at it. Um, that's really it. And then to maintain that type of stuff for life, when you're 70, 80 years old, do I expect you to, you know, be deadlifting and squatting like 500 pounds forever? No. Can you still deadlift and squat? Yeah. That's how you maintain it. And then also on top of that, maintaining like healthy movement of your joints. So like doing something every day that takes your joints, every one of them, through a full range of motion. So I like to go with cars. You know, I'm an FRC coach. That's kind of like the blood of FRC is cars. So that's like a very simple tool that you can use to move every single one of your joints through a full range of motion. That way you have full control of them when you need them. And that's really the answer that I would say, is that like the key to maintaining healthy movement and a strong body for life is to train consistently, do the movements that you do outside the most, like the, you know, compound movements, pressing, lunging, deadlifts, pulling. You get, you know,
Yes,
and
sir.
then keep on doing them. That's pretty much it. There's no like secret to it. That's just that's
Man, there's not a secrets to a lot of stuff anymore. We've unfortunately, because I think we'd all be a lot richer if we had like the secrets to stuff. But
Yeah.
so when you're conceptualizing, just say you're making a, we'll talk about more on like exercise selection later. But are you talking about movements, or are you talking about exercises? Because I think you obviously know this, but a lot of people they train exercise, or they work out exercises, they choose exercises, they're going to the gym, they're doing this machine, that machine, but they're not like going back to the fundamentals of human movement and just assessing whether there are kind of like fundamental movement patterns per se. So are you talking about, you said like the lunge and the squat and the deadlift, but is that the hip hinge? Are we pressing things overhead, stuff like that? Because I always like to break that down, because we can get too used to the idea that people necessarily follow ideologies, and what we're trying to do is step away from that, and like when it gets down to the basics, what are we going to do?
So you're talking like hip hinging and what, pressing?
Yeah, yeah. So I when we're I'll cut this out again too, but this is mostly for like somebody that is just going to the gym for the first time. They have maybe, 30 minutes after work. And we're trying to express to them that there are these really most bang for your buck approaches that don't necessarily involve doing the bicep curls and, the tricep extensions and the little ab machines and stuff like that. What would people focus on? What would it benefit people to focus on, movements or exercises?
Movements. Yeah, definitely movements. Exercises, you know, there's like so many different exercises, but there's just a few movements. There's movements, but there's a million ways to train them using exercises. Is that in the right
Yeah.
ballpark?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it sounds pretty like obvious to us, but I sat at the front desk of a gym. So as I was managing, I was also working the front desk from 4 o'clock in the morning until whenever. And the people would come in and be like, "Oh, what do you want to work out today? What do you want to work out today? Oh, I'm doing, this." But there wasn't much thought behind it further than that. So I
Right.
always like to try to kind of give people a different conceptual framework to work from, as you probably do
Okay.
with your clients.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
And then the other side of that, though, what do you have a hierarchy of movements in terms of like, what is somebody comes to you, they're, they can move a little bit, they're okay, they're ready to start training with you. What are those core movements, those core, I was going to say exercises, those core movements that you're doing day one?
Definitely, I want to make sure that their hips can rotate internally. I want to make sure, and I know this isn't the answer that you're looking for, but
I'm
this is
sure we'll
how I
get there.
attack it.
No, I want to hear it.
When I go through the assessment, I try to make sure that those hips work first. So like internal rotation, external rotation. If you don't have hip internal rotation, you don't have much of a working hip. So we really got to tackle that first. So that, like, depending on their assessment, that's where I would go, like, what's their first session going to look like? If I take them in for an assessment and they look really, really good and they're ready to, strength train right away, I still might have them do a few FRC sessions. But the first movements that I would have them do once they work like a normal human being, let's say, is definitely hip hinging, because that's
Okay.
a huge one that like not a lot of people like really take the time to train, and it's important in the squat and it's important in the deadlift. Hip hinging and pulling. A lot of people like pulling from different angles too. So pulling from the knees, pulling from up overhead, learning how to bring the shoulder blades back and down. Those are the type of movements, and lunges, I would say. So hip hinge, lunge, pull.
So with it, I want to talk about the hip hinge for a second, because holy shit, that's such an important movement to master. But I think that it obviously gets degraded very, very quickly. My girlfriend Haley's working with somebody who's in their 70s right now, and I kind of consult with her. She was using the stick mobility stick, and she was able to get him to actually maintain a good erect spine and lumbar extension throughout that hinge. It was very, very short range of motion at this point, but I what is the importance of being able to have an effective hip hinge, to be able to do that movement so everything loads appropriately?
Well, if you do it correctly, it takes away a lot of like really scary shit. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm.
if I'm thinking about a deadlift and you can't hip hinge properly, I'm thinking about that load going like right in the middle of your back or like right in your knee somewhere. And that's like, you can run into some problems if you don't know how to hip hinge properly. Same thing with the squat. If you squat and your hip hinge isn't exactly where it should be, and you can't, do it under control, you're going to just basically throw yourself into that position and hope to God you can come out of it. Your body's going to use whatever it's going to use to get yourself out of it. But that's why I think training movements is important, because like these movements, you might be able to do these movements, but your body, if you haven't learned how to do them correctly, your body does it in a different way, typically,
It
right?
compensates to accomplish what you want it to.
Exactly. And that is a real pain in the ass to like reverse. It's better when people come in and they don't really know what they're doing. And then you can kind of teach them these movements, because then they're not like, their body doesn't want to do one thing when they're trying to do another thing. And that's when people get frustrated. But yeah, like if you don't have a great hip hinge and then you go to do a deadlift, or even worse, like you're in a CrossFit class, you don't have a great hip hinge, and you go to do like a snatch or clean and jerk or some shit, and you don't have strong hips, you don't have a strong core, your back is taking the load right in the middle of it, you are asking to get injured. I think that's like one of the fun. I think like when people first join a CrossFit gym or something, they should have an entire week where they go through like the hip hinge, the squat, like how to do all of these movements properly before throwing people underneath the barbell.
That certainly set people up for. I don't know why we're not taught these movements, because you really could. I think if you got enough people in the room, enough people that understand movement, you could boil it down to some core, like an actual hierarchy of movement, like we talked about, to where you could probably narrow it down to 5 movements. Let's teach these 5 movements to kids in school. And you look at people that are like gymnasts growing up and they're just strong for their entire life. It's like this is the time that we should be doing those things at a very young age, so we learn them as a skill that is ingrained for later years. And speaking of that, so we've kind of been on this topic, skirting around this topic, and I think this is something that you really wanted to talk about. What role can resistance training, lifting weights, play in longevity, and how can you do it right?
Well, doing it right is like, making sure that you have good resources. So if you're doing it right is a tough question because, again, I sound biased, but if you don't know what you're doing, hire a coach. That's
Hmm.
like why we have a job. So like if you don't know how to do it right, number one, get a damn coach. Um, I already forgot the second part of the question. I'm sorry.
No, no, you're good, man. So I guess we can really focus on how can you choose and develop a program for the advanced age population. Like I said, this is the people that I worked with the most, and it's also a population that I think is pretty underserved in terms of personal trainers specializing in them. So how can we uh, create a program for older people or older clients, and that's going to promote longevity long term?
Well, A, teach them the movements that they need to know, like hip hinging. But old people, they're kind of stuck in the past, I've found.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the people who you try to introduce strength training to, and along with strength training, of course, you need good nutrition with that. And a lot of them are kind of still wrapped up in the low carb, low calorie, low fat type of
Mm-hmm.
era, like they're doing like Pilates and jazzercise as
Or
like
whatever Dr. Oz has told him to last week.
bam,
Yeah.
exactly. Eating like a cheese wheel and an apple for lunch type thing. And then you try to introduce them to something like strength training, something that was heavily marketed to like bodybuilders when they were trying to get the fittest in their prime. They're like, you're really, that's why you hear a lot of like the older women, like the Karens being like, oh, you're going to eat that much. Or like, aren't you
Mm-hmm.
going to get bulky? Like making those type of comments. That's kind of like the problem. So what I would say is teaching those people why it's important first. Like teaching them why the hip hinge is important, teaching them how the squat can help them do these other things in life, teaching them how to, if you can properly pull this way, this is how it's gonna, you know, um, correspond to your outdoor life. If they garden, this is how it's gonna help. Getting them to kind of understand that it's not about like getting super buff. It's about, doing movements pain free and easily. And then from there, I would say just let them start packing on weight as they go. Like a lot of these older people aren't getting like, they don't want to be huge bodybuilders. They
Mm-hmm.
don't. That's why I found that a combination of like focused mobility, having them build strength in end ranges, things that they really haven't been like too exposed to, especially probably recently. If we're talking about like people in their 60s to 70s, they don't do a whole lot. You know what I mean? And I'm sorry if you're 60 and 70 listening to this and you do a whole lot, but most of you guys don't do a whole lot. You sit at home on a chair doing something, and that's just what I've been exposed to. So for someone like that, focusing on that, getting them into those end ranges, and then building strength upon those slowly, and then really introducing them to strength training once they're more comfortable with it and they know that it's not like completely centered around bodybuilders. Um,
What are some of your go-to I'm going to say exercises just because for the
yep.
sake of exercise selection, but what are some of your go-to exercises for this population?
Um, I like, I always start them off with the squat, like a box squat. Have them
Yep.
sit down on an object, typically their chair, whatever chair that they sit
Yeah.
in the most, because I travel to people's homes and I train them there. So I try to get like really, really specific. I'm like, where do you sit the most? If they point at their desk chair, I'm having them trying to get up and down from that chair. And then, I teach them how to push properly, teach them on a wall. Then I teach them how to pull properly, have them go on like a TRX machine, have some hanging rows, slow eccentrics. And then I teach them how to hinge by doing floor bridges. I do good mornings. And I play around with the good mornings a little bit, front loaded on the back, do anti-rotation core stuff. And then after we get like a more stable core, we move into like moving the core under tension more. And throughout the whole time, we're doing like really focused mobility on their off days, general moving on their on days, walking, trying to get them to eat what they should be. Because 9 times out of 10, if I go to talk to a new person and they're in the 60s, 70s range, they eat like a 5-year-old, and it's
20
really
grams
hard
of
to get-
protein. Yeah. Yeah, it's incredibly common. I mean, and they were told not to eat these animal proteins. Like it was kind of indoctrinated into that culture at the time, and it's certainly it's a lasting problem. And I mean, there's obviously biological mechanisms as we get older. We're just less we have less of an appetite, and we just aren't drawn to eating as much food. That's awesome though. So hearing that, it's very refreshing, because that sounded exactly like my process for training people of that age, because you have to go with what they're going to be doing. So you, like you said, sitting down up and down at their chair, you're going to see them maybe twice a week. Correct me if I'm wrong, probably about twice, 2 to 3 times a week. And
2 to 3, yeah.
you can get X amount of reps in, but they're going to do X times 10 when you're not there. So why not make it the most applicable to the daily life? Make it in a way that they're going to be able to repeat that day after day. And really just meeting them where they're at. And again, trying to assess what are some core freaking principles that we can apply, that we can look to first and foremost, and then obviously scale up or down those to start, and then progress them or regress them as needed. But there really are, like you said, the anti-rotation of the core. I like to do anti-lateral flexion, like carrying things. And the lunges, if you can get people into like starting with a step up on just a regular stair, and then anytime you can get people on one leg, oh man.
Or step downs.
Step downs, exactly. In all planes of motion. It's just we have to kind of step away again from these dogmatic ideologies where it's like, I am a bodybuilder coach, or I identify as a bodybuilder, but I also train old people. But it's like, they're completely different beasts. It's like you have to assess what's going to make them move better, live better, things like that.
Yeah, and so far I've found that when you tie those movement patterns with something that they enjoy doing, they take it a little bit more seriously. So like, especially carrying things, like a lot of people have trouble carrying things. Like I know that from when I lived with my grandmother. She had a really bad knee, and so she couldn't really carry a lot of stuff while she was walking. So whenever I get a client like that, I'm like, do you want to rely on your grandchildren to carry your stuff inside for you all the time? Obviously, they're like, well, no, obviously not. And I'm like, well, this is why we do this, and this is how you can do it better when you're on your own, not with me. Or if they garden frequently, like this is how you can avoid your shoulder pain at night when you're sleeping. You can do this with your shoulders and keep them more down towards your butt as you're carrying, blah, blah, blah. And stuff like that has really helped them solidify. And then, then you get the texts from them being like, hey, I was doing that thing the other day, and I was like, no, I got the groceries. And, that's where they see the return. And that's where they're like, oh shit, I'm like really, really making a difference in my life with what I'm doing here.
Yeah, that just reminds me so much of, do you feel that you have to apologize sometimes for other personal trainers? Like people come to you having worked with another trainer, and they're kind of expecting this completely different relationship than what you bring to the table?
Not like nearby trainers, but like I've constantly got to be like, yeah, that guy's an idiot, or like, let me see what that guy said. And I'm like, that's a bunch of horse shit. Like they constantly show me like TikToks and stuff, basically, and they're like, this guy said this, and I'm like, well, this is wrong because this, and this, and yeah, that sucks. But fortunately, I don't have a lot of horror stories of people nearby, but I do know someone else who works in Concord who does hear some pretty bad horror stories from like commercial gyms. But I work with like a different crowd, the in-home crowd, I'd say.
Yeah, the commercial gym environment certainly isn't conducive to maintaining personal trainers that are like at that next level where they want to make a big difference. But I'm really
Right.
glad that you explained how you convey those benefits to people of strength training, of lifting weights, because again, what you do in your session, is important, obviously, and they benefit from it significantly. But if they're not doing anything on their own, like they better be seeing you a lot more than twice a week if you want to make those long-term changes. So that's like I said, it's very refreshing to hear somebody with a similar mindset. But on that note, kind of really just how the personal trainers can improve. How do you feel that your industry can improve overall?
I've been thinking about this one.
Excellent.
Stop feeding people bullshit.
I'd agree with
So
that.
many people feed people bullshit for money. A lot of people get into the fitness industry, I think, as a money grab. And that was really solidified by a Mind Pump episode that I just listened to with the creator of Tonal, or the owner of Tonal. This tech guy
Mm-hmm.
comes in and he just, he's like, oh, enter in the fitness industry, and just like, gets a ton of money. And granted, the guy's helping out people, but like, to what extent? He just made like another piece of equipment for these
Mm-hmm.
people. And it's like, you're not really solving their problem.
No.
Fitness is a whole lot more than just fucking giving people exercise. Like, these are real human organisms. Like, I don't think that a lot of people understand what we do. We are managing a human's health. That is like an enormous responsibility. And I think people, if they took that more seriously, would give a little bit more of a shit of their clients. You wouldn't see a bunch of trainers driving Mercedes and their clients are like wondering why they're not hitting it back up, or like, they've got 100,000 online clients that they're shipping the same fucking program every month. It's so much more in depth, and that's where I really start to see, people are kind of waking up to that recently, I think.
Yeah,
people
noticed.
are more willing to spend the money on a quality professional who really, really wants to help them. And they're seeing through like all of the smoke and shade through like fucking B Shred and people like that. That is really where it gets like annoying, man. I'm passionate about this answer because I like dealt with that shit. I did for like years. I dealt with like so many wrong answers. And granted, as I was growing up and as I was going through this, maybe some of the information wasn't like the best. Like the information that was out at that time, like, was low carb, like super low carb was still like a thing. You know what I mean? So I guess like we're starting to learn more about the industry, but throughout, I think a lot of people were starting to get the right idea, but they marketed it more towards the people who wanted a quick fix. And now a lot of people have that mentality where they go into it and they're like, quick fix. Hiring a trainer is going to get me shredded in no time. It's wrong. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of like mental blocks that go along with it. But yeah, I wish people would really stop selling people bullshit and start giving a fuck about the people that they're really taking care of. Because, this means a lot to a lot of people, man. Their health is serious. Their mental feelings about their body image is serious. And, like, people are spending so much money. People pay me thousands of dollars to help them. They trust in me to help them with their health. And I cannot imagine people giving some schmuck all of their money just for them to not really give a fuck. Pardon my language too.
No, go for it, man. No, I mean, it just shows how passionate you are about it because, I mean, speaking of Mind Pump, when I first ran into them, I remember Sal saying something about personal trainers being the entry to the healthcare system. And obviously, we have a scope of practice. There's obviously limitations to what we can do, but I think just embodying that mindset is incredibly beneficial because you're right. It is pretty fucking important. Like, you don't know if that 40-year-old mom, and this is like the 5th trainer she's been to, and she's at the end of her fucking rope, and she's going to spend the rest of her life just degrading because you know, I wouldn't even say underserved her, but just did not care to go the extra mile in your own life and your own professional development to be able to help her. So
Right.
that's awesome, man. That was a great answer. I really appreciate you just not holding back on that one.